As you can tell by the name of this channel, I ask you, the viewers, to go nudge yourself. In this video, I will answer questions like what is a nudge, what is a bias, and why you should be nudging yourself. I will conclude by making the case for self-nudging as being the optimal approach for managing biases. Biases occur when individuals deviate from rational decisions and behaviors in predictable patterns. While random deviations from rationality would eventually cancel each other out, these unique predictable patterns cannot just be seen as noise or glitches, but rather permanent features of human behavior. Seen another way, a bias is simply a tendency, implicit or explicit, to reach or sustain a certain kind of outcome or conclusion. This interpretation accommodates the idea that biases can lead to bad and unethical decisions, but it also leaves open the possibility that biases actually positively contribute to our decision making. When we think of managing biases, it is a natural assumption that we cannot always control the situations in which the biases occur. Therefore, a more feasible approach is to provide people some combination of training, knowledge, and experiences to manage their biases. Well, let's look at some of these techniques. Firstly, people can be taught appropriate rules and principles for rational decision making. For example, generating appropriate number of alternatives before deciding, tempering optimism by thinking of the opposite or articulating reasons why an initial assessment might be wrong, consulting others to accumulate diverse viewpoints, and assessing uncertainty by identifying known and unknown variables. Next, simple numerical models like weighting, scoring, and ranking can reduce the opportunities for bias to creep into decisions and reduce their quality. Another promising technique being explored by researchers is decision-making simulations and games which provide practice and personalized feedback for managing biases. But there are some major shortcomings of the education and training approach. Firstly, in many aspects of behavior, we see a gap between our intentions and actions. This gap can be understood in terms of the difference between liking and wanting. Liking is a preference or an attitude, while wanting is a visceral motivational drive that triggers directed action. So, environmental cues can lead to a drastic increase in wanting without changing liking. These increased degrees of motivation lead to the wanting and liking gap by driving impulsive decision making. Next, there is a bias called the bias blind spot that prevents us from seeing our own biases. Studies have found that people consider their own judgments to be less susceptible to bias than the judgments of others. And if we can't identify our own biases, then we can't hope to manage them. Because many biases work below our conscious awareness and leave no trace of their operations, an introspective search for evidence of bias often turns up empty. And when we fail to detect evidence of bias, we decide that our decision-making process was indeed objective and reasonable. But when it comes to judging others' biases, we only have access to their behaviors and not to their introspections. And so we judge their biases very differently from ours. Now this leads to the belief that objective and reasonable others must share our perceptions and judgments. And if they don't, that means that they are biased. So we can see that the bias blind spot and the liking-wanting gap significantly undermine the efficacy of the educational and training approach to debiasing. Now let's look at another approach of bias mitigation, which seeks to modify the environment instead of modifying the individual. There are two very different ways of modifying the environment. The first approach is to change something about the situation which makes individuals process information more appropriately. The second approach adapts the environment to people's biases. Now, both these approaches can be categorized under the broader concept of nudging. Nudging is defined as careful design of individuals' choice environment in order to steer their behavior in desired direction without compromising their freedom of choice. Nudges are the strategies or interventions that are put in place for this purpose. They generally work by either harnessing people's cognitive biases or minimizing them. Now, the first type of nudges work by appropriately and timely activating our analytical system, which can detect and override biases. The key here is intervening at the time that the bias occurs or is just about to occur. The analytical system may be engaged by building planned interruptions into the choice environment in order to encourage added reflection, or by requiring decision makers to make an active choice between multiple alternatives rather than simply avoiding a choice and accepting the default. Another way of engaging the analytical system is framing the information such that it is easily understood and linked with the decision maker's goals and interests. Highlighting important aspects, providing summaries, and disclosing less obvious information could help improve decision quality. The second type of nudges work by using people's biases to steer their behavior in the desired direction instead of trying to reduce the biases. These nudges may take multiple forms. Incentives realign people's motivations. Choice architecture involves presenting alternatives in a manner such that the best option seems more favorable. Defaults leverage people's decision inertia and implicitly suggest a recommended course of action. Social proof uses others' decisions to influence towards a recommended course of action. And prompts include warnings, reminders, and feedback. Based on studies and real-world data, it is clear that nudging is more effective than education and training. Nonetheless, nudging comes with its own set of limitations and challenges. First, it is not clear how nudgers can detect the choices that individuals judge to be in their best interests. Second, by discouraging active choice, nudges may reduce the individual capability to make critically reflected autonomous decisions. And finally, over time, nudges can put individuals at danger to learn being helpless and to lose their ability of pursuing their own happiness. Overall, nudges that activate our analytical system are more ethical and well-being conducive compared to nudges that harness our non-conscious biases. Nonetheless, all nudges create some sort of dependency on the nudger and have long-term impact on agency and autonomy. Therefore, the final question we must ask is there an approach of managing biases that hits the sweet spot between being effective and ethical? Well, this brings us to our final concept, self-nudging. Self-nudging is self-determined and it rests on the assumption that individuals can learn to understand the environmental factors that challenge their self-control and decision-making quality. It also assumes that individuals are able to use the same evidence-based principles that nudging uses in the public sphere to their own immediate environment in order to improve their decision-making outcomes. Proponents of self-nudging suggest that knowledge about nudges and how they work can be actively shared with the general public, thereby enabling people to address what they believe to be failures of their decision-making and self-control. Now, let's look at some ways in which you can nudge yourself towards better decisions for your well-being. Firstly, use reminders and prompts, such as leaving your running shoes by the front door, so when you see them, it's easier to slip them on and go for a run. Or use an app to remind you to stick to healthy habits during the day, or to invest regularly. Second, choose a different framing. For example, the decision between taking an elevator and a staircase can be seen from the lens of health instead of convenience. Next, reduce the accessibility of things that can harm us by making them less convenient. Or conversely, we can make it easier to do things that we want to do. For example, change the default settings of your device to disable notifications from social media apps. Similarly, push the cookies to the back of the cupboard and place the healthy nuts in front of them. Next, use social pressure to increase accountability. For example, make a public declaration about your investment or health goals and enlist your family, friends, and social media networks to help you make good on it. Next, use defaults. For example, setting up automatic payments to your savings account on a monthly basis. And finally, use commitment devices which restrict your own choice set and freedoms in situations where you expect self-control issues in the future. For example, only taking a fixed amount of cash while heading out to party for the night, or buying an annual gym membership instead of paying by the visit. And to conclude, self-nudging is the optimal bias mitigation strategy. It can be as effective as nudging, plus it preserves our autonomy. It is most well aligned to our subjective well-being, and we only get better as self-nudgers with time. Remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down here. And before the libertarian paternalists come to nudge you, you better go nudge yourself. See you next time.